We can see the development of face in the 4th week. Okay. So what is the important point for the start of the development of face? It's the two bulgings that takes place after your cranial or head fold. Okay. The cranial bulging is going to develop as your what process? Fronto-nasal process, whereas the caudal bulging will give a site for the development of your heart region. Okay. And after that, what event takes place? Once the fronto-nasal process develops, what is going to happen? Enlargement takes place. Okay. Along with the frontonasal process, your first pharyngeal arch give rise to two other process, that is maxillary and mandibular process. Okay. So your mandibular process will join on both the sides and give rise to lower lip and lower cheek regions, whereas your maxillary process will not combine or fuse with each other at this particular point. Okay. After that, in your frontonasal process, we can see two what? We can see the two swellings, that is your mesodermal swellings. The medial swelling is called nasal placodes and the lateral swellings are called lens placodes. Okay. Once the nasal placodes form, it is going to give rise for your nasal pit, and the nasal pit will open into your which part? Stomodium part, which is going to develop as a oral cavity in future. Once the nasal pit formation takes place, there will be the differentiation of mesodermal cells that leads to the formation of two other important processes. What are those? Medial nasal process and lateral nasal process. By this time, your lens placode, which is present on the lateral side, will move towards the medial side and give rise to the eye region. Okay. And later your maxillary process will combine with the frontonasal process and give rise to your philtrum, upper lip and upper cheek regions. And your frontonasal region will give rise to forehead part, the nose region, that is tip of the nose, ala of the nose, and also the nasal septum part. Okay. This is all about the development of face. What are the clinical conditions? We have cleft. Okay, fine. So what are the different types of cleft we see? Unilateral, okay, fine. And one more important point is oblique lip cleft, okay, which extend up to your eye region. Other than that, we have two important clinical conditions. The first one is microstomia and macrostomia. Next, we will see the development of palate. Development of palate and development of face are interlinked. Okay. Your frontonasal process plus the maxillary process will give rise to your palate region. Okay. And we have two divisions in palate. What are those? Okay, soft palate, hard palate. Any other division that we see in the adult structure? We are studying about the embryo part, right? So here we have primary palate and secondary palate. Okay, we have primary palate and secondary palate. So now I will draw the rough diagram. Imagine this is your maxillary process present. Stop talking on both the sides, and here we have mandibular process, and this entire part is your frontonasal process. What are the structures we see in the frontonasal process? So, I will draw only the medial and lateral plate process, okay. So, this is your medial nasal process, whereas this one is your lateral nasal process. To know how the primary and secondary palate develops, we have to do the section study. So, the primary palate develops from your frontonasal process. For that, we have to take the horizontal section, okay, and your secondary palate develops from your maxillary process. For this, we have to take longitudinal section. Okay, any doubts? Any doubts in this? I will repeat, we have frontonasal process and maxillary process. These two processes together give rise to palate, and your palate have two division, primary palate and secondary palate. To know the embryology of the primary palate, we have to study the horizontal section. To know the secondary development, we have to study the longitudinal section. Okay, any doubts? Any doubts in this? Okay. Now, if I have to take the horizontal section, I will be taking section at this level, okay. And here your two medial nasal process is going to meet with each other, okay. If I take the section at that level, this is how the structure will look, okay. What is this? This is your fused medial nasal process. On either side to that, we have maxillary process. So, this is the maxillary process, okay. And this is the anterior aspect, and this is the posterior aspect in the horizontal section, okay. So, now in this part, that is in your fused medial nasal process, on the posterior aspect, we can see a projection like this. This projection is nothing but your primary palate. This is how the development of primary palate takes place. Any doubts? Any doubts in this? Okay. So, from this we have to take the horizontal section. I am taking horizontal section at this level, where your two medial nasal process will meet with one another, okay. So, in a horizontal section, this is how the structure will look. The very first part is your fused medial nasal process. On either side, we have maxillary process, right. So, this will be your maxillary process. So, this is the anterior aspect and this is the posterior aspect. On posterior aspect of the fused part, we have a small projection coming out, okay. That projection is nothing but your primary palate. This is how the development of primary palate takes place. Is it clear for everyone? Okay. Next, we will take the longitudinal section. So, in this figure or from this part, we have to take the longitudinal section, okay. So, if I take the longitudinal section, this is how the structure will look. Okay. So this is how the section will look in the longitudinal aspect. This septum is called nasal septum. Okay. So if this is the nasal septum, what is this structure? If this is the nasal septum, what is these structures called? What structure is present on either side of your nasal septum? It's the nasal cavity. So this is your nasal cavity on both the sides. So below the nasal cavity, we have one more important process at this section, that is called palatal process. Okay. This process is called palatal process, and your primary palate is also known as primitive palate. Primitive palate. So now in this part, your nasal septum will start moving in the downward direction, and also your palatal process will start moving towards the midline point, like this. Okay. So at one point your nasal septum will come and join with your palatal process. Okay. What's making you laugh so much? Black color kurta. Yeah. Okay. So once the fusion takes place, this is how the structure will look. Your nasal septum will come and join your nasal septum will come and join your palatal process, and this will leads to the formation of your secondary palate. Okay. Any doubts? Any doubts in this? No doubts? Okay. So we have seen the development of primary palate and also the secondary palate. But in the adult palate, we have a part or a division called soft and hard palate. So how the soft and hard palate is going to develop from these structures? So once the formation of your primary and secondary palate takes place, it is going to fuse with each other in a Y-shaped manner. So like this. Okay. This part is nothing but your primary palate, and the secondary palate is present on either side, on right also, left also, but your primary palate is only a single palate, remember this. So this is primary palate, on either side we have secondary palate. So now this is going to form a structure like this. Okay, so this is secondary palate, this is also secondary palate. Okay. So now from this structure your hard and soft palate is going to develop. The posterior part of this fusion structure, that means this section, will not undergo any ossification. So there will be no ossification. As a result, this part is going to develop as a soft palate. Okay. But the anterior part of the fusion structure will undergo ossification and it will develop as a hard palate. Okay. And this posterior most structure is called, what it is called? It is called uvula. Okay. This is how the formation of your primary and secondary palate takes place in the embryo phase. Later it is going to develop as a hard and soft palate. Okay. So once the primary and secondary palate develops, it is going to fuse with each other. So here we have primary palate, on either side we have secondary palate. The posterior part of the fusion structure will not undergo any kind of ossification, so it leads to the formation of soft palate, whereas the anterior part of the fused structure will undergo ossification and it will lead to the formation of hard palate. This is how the formation or development of the palate takes place in the embryo life. Any doubts? Any doubts in this? Yes or no? Any doubts? Okay. Embryologically, the palate consists of two parts, that is primary palate and secondary palate. The primary palate develops from the frontonasal process, whereas the secondary palate develops from the maxillary process. Development of palates begins in the 6th week and completes by the end of the 12th week. Remember, the development of phase starts from 4th week and it will almost end by the 7th week, whereas your development of palate takes place from 6th to 12th week. Okay. The palate develops in two stages, that is development of primary palate and development of secondary palate. The development of primary palate is formed by the fusion of two medial nasal process of the frontonasal process. The fusion of these process takes place at the deeper level and it forms a wedge-shaped mass of mesenchyme opposite to your upper jaw, carrying 4 incisor teeth called the primary palate. It ossifies to form a pre-maxilla. Okay, is it clear? So your primary palate is formed by the fusion of two medial nasal process, and later it will lead to the formation of, it carries your incisor teeth, and that time it is called primary palate. Okay, you can see here these diagrams I have already drawn and shown, so just compare the structures. This is intermaxillary segment, that is nothing but the fused part of your two medial nasal process. On either side we have maxillary process. So from that intermaxillary segment on the this is the anterior aspect and this is the posterior aspect. Okay. On the posterior aspect you can see the primary palate. Sit down. Sit. This is your primary palate, which is also called as premaxilla because it holds your 4 incisor teeth in this region. Okay. So any doubt in this? Any doubt in the development of primary palate? Okay. Next we have the development of secondary palate. It is the main part of the definitive palate. The adult palate, where I have shown the development of hard and soft palate, that structure is called definitive palate. Okay. It is formed by fusion of two shelf-like outgrowths called palatine shelf from inner aspect of the maxillary process. The palatine shelf appears in the 6th week of development. Initially they grow downward and medially on each side of and below the tongue region. Later, during the 7th and 8th week, they assume horizontal position above the tongue and fuse with each other to form the secondary palate. This is exactly what I have explained here. I have mentioned about the nasal septum and nasal cavity present on both the side. After that, I said beneath this structure we can see the palatine process. It is nothing but your tongue region where we can see the presence of palatine process. Later these structures fuse with each other to form the secondary palate region. Okay. You can see here. This is the nasal cavity, this is the nasal septum On either side we have nasal cavity, and this is the palatine shelf, or we can also call it as palatal process. Both words are also right. So after certain development, this nasal septum and your palatine shells will fuse with each other, giving rise to your secondary palate. Okay. Once the completion of your primary and secondary palate development takes place, they again fuse with each other to give rise to your definitive palate, which is present in the adult structures. Okay. So this is the primitive, that is primary palate, and which will develop into your hard palate because it undergoes the ossification process. And this is the posterior part, it will not undergo any kind of ossification, so it leads to the soft palate. The posterior most structure is called uvula. What is the significance or importance of uvula? What is the importance or significance of the structure uvula? Entry of? Okay. Any other clinical importance? What is the significance of uvula? Take down it as an assignment question. What is the significance or importance of uvula? Find out the clinical. Say it. Okay, right. Write it as an assignment question, okay? So this is how the hard and soft palate will develop in the embryo. The secondary palate is the primordium of most of the hard part and all of soft part of the adult palate. Once the palatine shelves are fused, the ossification extends from the maxilla and palatine bones into these shelves to form the hard palate part. The posterior part of these processes that extends posteriorly beyond the nasal septum fail to ossify, and it forms the soft palate, including its soft conical projection, that is called uvula. Okay, any doubts? This is the tabular column for the palate and also its source of development. You can see the hard palate will develop from the fused medial nasal processes of your frontonasal process, whereas the soft palate will develop from the unossified part of the fused palatine shelf, that is also known as palatal process. Next we have clinical anatomy. It is similar to your cleft lip part. Okay. Next we have cleft palate. The defective fusion of various segments of palate give rise to clefts in the palate region. These vary considerably in degree, leading to the varieties of cleft palate as follows. We have complete cleft palate, the very first condition. In that we have unilateral and bilateral. Unilateral complete cleft palate occurs if maxillary process on one side does not fuse with the premaxilla part. It is always associated with the cleft lip on the same side. So what did you understand? What happens in the unilateral cleft palate? Your maxillary process does not fuse with the premaxilla part, that means the primary palate part. So it will leads to the both condition, that is cleft lip on the same side, that is unilateral cleft lip, and also unilateral cleft palate. Okay. Bilateral complete cleft palate occurs if both the maxillary process fail to fuse with the premaxilla. In this type, secondary palate is divided into two equal halves by a median cleft with the anterior V-shaped. In this type, secondary palate is divided into two equal halves by a median cleft with an anterior V-shaped cleft separating the premaxilla completely. So you can see here, Can you identify the condition? The very first condition is your unilateral cleft palate, which is happening only on one side. This is the premaxillar part and this is the maxillary process part, where they are not combining with each other. And the B picture shows the bilateral cleft palate. On both the sides, both your premaxilla is not fusing or combining with your maxillary process part. Okay. The next condition is incomplete or partial cleft palate. The following types may occur, that is bifid, uvula and cleft of the soft palate. Cleft involving only uvula, it is of no clinical importance, and cleft of the soft palate, that is involving uvula and adjoining part of the soft palate, or involving uvula with all of the soft palate and extends until the hard palate part. So, what did you understood? What happens in the incomplete cleft palate? In the incomplete cleft palate, we have two conditions. One is bifid uvula and another one is cleft of the soft palate. So, what is happening here? Can you see the diagram and explain? Cleft happening only in the posterior most part of your definitive palate. That means it is affecting only the uvula part. Here you can see that. Okay. The next two conditions are cleft of the soft palate. The very first condition will start from the uvula and extends up to the certain level of soft palate and it will stop there. But the C condition, where it will start from the uvula and extends up to your hard palate region. These are the two important clinical conditions. Cleft of the palate, the very first one is complete cleft palate, second one is incomplete cleft palate. Any doubts? So, this finish your development of face and also the palate. Any doubts in this chapter? Yes or no? No doubts? Okay. So, what is the condition in first question? What is happening? A baby was born with unilateral cleft lip extending through alveolar process of the maxilla into the palate region. What is the embryological basis of this anomaly, and discuss symptoms from which the child is suffering? Forget about the symptom part, let us discuss about what is the embryological basis for this particular anomaly. So, what is the embryological basis for this condition? Failure of fusion of maxillary process and okay, fine. So, what will be the symptoms? Any idea? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Next question. The cleft lip is often associated with cleft palate. So, what is the embryological basis? Just now we have discussed about it. What is that? First thing, the maxillary process will fail to fuse with each other, where it leads to the formation of unilateral cleft lip. Later, the same maxillary process will fail to fuse with your primary palate. Okay. So, that leads to the formation of unilateral cleft palate. Okay. Next question. So, in the third question, the upper lip developed from two different sources. So, what are the two different sources? It is the frontonasal process and maxillary process, but general sensory innervation is provided only by nerves of the maxillary process, that is the maxillary nerves. Why? So, if it is developing from both frontonasal process, the innervation can also happen by your ophthalmic nerve, right? And for the maxillary process, we have maxillary nerves. But here the innervation is happening only by the maxillary nerves, but not by the ophthalmic nerves of the trigeminal nerve. What is the embryological basis, or what? Why? Okay. So, what is happening here? An epileptic mother. What do you mean by epileptic? What is that condition? Epilepsy. Okay, fine. Any other answer? What happens if a person is suffering from epilepsy? Okay, okay. This first question, I'll give the answer. While sharing notes to your CR, I'll share it with answer. All of you read it and come once. Later in the next session, before I start the session, remind me about this, I'll discuss. Okay, no need to write assignment for that first question. Next question, please. So the question is, the clefts of the lip and palate are the most common congenital anomalies. Can they be recognized or identified before birth by ultrasonography? Is it possible? Yes. How? Okay, some visible changes will appear in the embryo during the scan. Okay. Okay, one possibility. Fine. Okay. So what you will write answer for second question? For the development of palate, first you have to start with the two divisions. We have primary and secondary palate, and then you have to mention the point that primary palate is going to develop from the frontonasal process and secondary palate is going to develop from the maxillary process. After that, write one or two diagrams and then explain the formation of primary palate separately and secondary palate, then go for the definitive palate structure. Okay. So your upper lip developed from all the process except which option? Okay, fine. Any other answers? Okay, next question. So nasolacrimal groove lies in the line of fusion of maxillary process and nasolacrimal duct. I have mentioned and nasolacrimal sac. So from this your nasolacrimal duct there will be one elongation, that is nothing but the nasolacrimal groove. Okay. So what is the answer for second question? Okay. Which option? Okay. Any other answers? Which one is the most common? Okay, fine. Unilateral cleft of upper lip with cleft palate. Okay, any other answers? Okay, next question.
Incorrect statement about the development source. Okay. A dorsum is formed by front nasal process. The nasal cavities are formed by nasal pits. C. Tiny are formed by rupture of common nasal membranes. The apex is formed by digital nasal process.
So what is the wrong statement about the development of nose structure? Which option? Okay.